All right, this is Afternoon Story 1 from the Junior Great Books series. This is Prince Rabbit by A. Milne. Once upon a time, there was a king who had no children. Sometimes he would say to the queen, "If only we had a son," and the queen would answer, "If only we had." Then, on another day, he would say, "If only we had a daughter," and the queen would sigh and answer, "Yes, even if we had a daughter, that would be something." But they had no children at all. As the years went on and there were still no children in the royal palace, the people began to ask each other who would be the next king to reign over them. And some said that perhaps it would be the chancellor, which was a pity, as nobody liked him very much. And others said that there would be no king at all, but that everyone would be equal. Those who were lowest of all thought that this would be a satisfactory ending of the matter, but those who were higher up felt that, though in some respects it would be a good thing, yet in other respects it would be an ill-advised state of affairs, and they hoped, therefore, that a young prince would be born in the palace. But no prince was born. One day, when the chancellor was in audience with the king, it seemed well to him to speak what was in the people's minds. "Your Majesty," he said, and then stopped, wondering how best to put it. "Well," said the king. "I have your Majesty's permission to speak my mind?" "So far, yes," said the king. Encouraged by this, the chancellor resolved to put the matter plainly. "In the event of your Majesty's death," he coughed and began again. If your Majesty ever should die," he said, "which in any case will not be for many years, if ever, as I hardly need say your Majesty's loyal subjects earnestly hope. They hope it will be never. But assuming for the moment, making the sad assumption—" "You said you wanted to speak your mind," interrupted the king. "Is this it?" "Yes, your Majesty." "Then I don't think much of it." "Thank you, your Majesty." "What you are trying to say is, who will be the next king?" "Quite so, your Majesty." "Ah." The king was silent for a little. Then he said, "I can tell you who won't be." The chancellor did not seek for information on this point, feeling that, in the circumstances, the answer was obvious. "What do you suggest yourself?" "That your Majesty choose a successor from among the young and the highly born of the country, putting him to whatever test seems good to your Majesty." The king pulled at his beard and frowned. "There must be not one test, but many tests. Let all who will offer themselves, provided only that they are under the age of 20 and are well born. See to it." He waved his hand in dismissal, and with an accuracy established by long practice, the chancellor retired backwards out of the palace. On the following morning, therefore, it was announced that all who were ambitious to be appointed the king's successor, and who were of high birth and not yet come to the age of 20, should present themselves a week later for the tests to which his Majesty desired to put them, the first of which was to be a running race. Whereat the people rejoiced, for they wished to be ruled by one whom they could look up, and running was much esteemed in that country. On the appointed day, the excitement was great. All along the course, which was once around the palace, large crowds were massed, and at the finishing point the king and queen themselves were seated in a specially erected pavilion. And to this pavilion the competitors were brought to be introduced to their Majesties. There were 9 young nobles, well-built and handsome, and, it was thought, intelligent, who were competitors. And there was also one rabbit. The chancellor had first noticed the rabbit when he was lining up the competitors, pinning numbers on their backs so that the people should identify them, and giving them such instructions as seemed necessary to him. Now, be off with you," he had said. "Competitors only, this way." And he had made a motion of impatient dismissal with his foot. "I am a competitor," said the rabbit, "and I don't think it is usual," he added, with dignity, "for the starter to kick one of the competitors just at the beginning of an important foot race. It looks like favoritism." "You can't be a competitor," laughed all the young nobles. Why not? Read the rules. The Chancellor, feeling rather hot suddenly, read the rules. The rabbit was certainly under 20. He had a pedigree which showed that he was of the highest birth, and, said the rabbit, I am ambitious to be appointed the king's successor. Those were all the conditions. Now, let us get on with the race. But first came the introduction to the king. One by one, the competitors came up, and at the end, this, said the Chancellor, as airily as he could, is Rabbit. Rabbit bowed in the most graceful manner possible, first to the king, and then to the queen. But the king only stared at him. Then he turned to the Chancellor. Well? The Chancellor shrugged his shoulders. His entry does not appear to lack validity, he said. He means, Your Majesty, that it is all right, explained the rabbit. The king laughed suddenly. Go on, he said. We can always have a race for a new chancellor afterwards. So the race was started, and the young Lord Calomel was much cheered on coming in second, not only by their majesties, but also by Rabbit, who had finished the course some time before and was now lounging in the royal pavilion. A very good style, Your Majesty, said Rabbit, turning to the king, although, altogether, he seems to be a most promising youth. Most, said the king grimly. So much so that I do not propose to trouble the rest of the competitors. The next test shall take place between you and him. Not racing, again, please, Your Majesty. That would hardly be fair to his lordship. No, not racing. Fighting. Ah, what sort of fighting? With swords, said the king. I am a little rusty with swords, but I dare say in a day or two. It will be now, said the king. You mean, Your Majesty, as soon as Lord Calomel has recovered his breath? The king answered nothing, but turned to his chancellor. Tell the young Lord Calomel that in half an hour I desire him to fight with this rabbit. The young Lord Rabbit, murmured the other competitor to the chancellor. To fight with him for my kingdom. And borrow me a sword, will you? Said Rabbit. Quite a small one. I don't want to hurt him. So half an hour later, on a level patch of grass in front of the pavilion, the fight began. It was a short but exciting struggle. Calomel, whirling his long sword in his strong right arm, dashed upon Rabbit, and Rabbit, carrying his short sword between his teeth, dodged between Calomel's legs and brought him toppling. And when it was seen that the young lord rose from the ground with a broken arm, and that with utmost gallantry he had now taken his sword in his left hand, the people cheered. And Rabbit, dropping his sword for a moment, cheered too. Then he picked it up and got entangled in his adversary's legs again, so that, again, the young Lord Calomel crashed to the ground, this time with a sprained ankle. And there he lay. Rabbit trotted to the royal pavilion and dropped his sword in the chancellor's lap. Thank you so much, he said. Have I won? And the king frowned and pulled at his beard. There are other tests, he muttered. But what were they to be? It was plain that the Lord Calomel was in no condition for another physical test. What, then, of an intellectual test? After all, said the king to the queen that night, intelligence is a quality not without value to a ruler. Is it? Asked the queen, doubtfully. I have found it so, said the king, a little haughtily. Oh, said the queen. There is a riddle of which my father was fond, the answer to which has never been revealed save to the royal house. We might make this the final test between them. What is the riddle? I fancy it goes like this. He thought for a moment, and then recited it, beating time with his hand. The first I do for your delight, although 'tis neither black nor white. My second looks the other way, yet always goes to bed by day. My whole can fly and climb a tree, and sometimes swims upon the sea. What is the answer? Asked the queen. As far as I remember, said his majesty, it is either dormouse or raspberry. Dormouse doesn't make sense, objected the queen. Neither does Raspberry, pointed out the king. Then how can they guess it? They can't. But my idea is that young Calomel should be secretly told beforehand what the answer is, so that he may win the competition. Is that fair? Asked the queen doubtfully. Yes, said the king, certainly, or I wouldn't have suggested it. So it was duly announced by the chancellor that the final test between the young Lord Calomel and Rabbit would be the solving of an ancient riddle-me-ree, which in the past had baffled all save those of royal blood. Copies of the riddle had been sent to the competitors, and in a week from the day they would be called upon to give their answers before their majesties and the full court. And with Lord Calomel's copy went a message which said this: From a friend. The answer is Dormouse. Burn this. The day came round, and Calomel and Rabbit were brought before their majesties, and they bowed to their majesties and were ordered to be seated, for Calomel's ankle was still painful to him. And when the chancellor had called for silence, the king addressed those present, explaining the conditions of the test to them. And the answer to this riddle, he said, is in this sealed paper, which I now hand to my chancellor, in order that he shall open it as soon as the competitors have told us what they know of the matter. The people, being uncertain what else to do, cheered slightly. I will ask Lord Calomel first, his majesty went on. He looked at his lordship, and his lordship nodded slightly. And Rabbit, noticing that nod, smiled suddenly to himself. Lord Calomel, said the king, what do you consider to be the best answer to this riddle-me-ree? The young lord tried to look very wise, and he said, There are many possible answers to this riddle-me-ree, but it seems the best answer is Dormouse. Let someone take a note of that answer, said the king, whereupon the chief secretary wrote down, Lord Calomel, Dormouse. Now, said the king to Rabbit, what suggestion have you to make in this matter? Rabbit, who had spent an anxious week inventing answers each more impossible than the last, looked down modestly. Well, said the king. Your Majesty, said Rabbit with some apparent hesitation, I have a great respect for the intelligence of the young Lord Calomel, but I think that in this matter he is mistaken. The answer is not, as he suggests, woodlouse, but dormouse. I said dormouse, cried Calomel indignantly. I thought you said woodlouse, said Rabbit in surprise. He certainly said dormouse, said the king coldly. Woodlouse, I think, said Rabbit. Lord Calomel, Dormouse, read out the chief secretary. There you are, said Calomel. I did say Dormouse. My apologies, said Rabbit with a bow. Then we are both right, for Dormouse it certainly is. Kitty, kitty, come back. The chancellor broke open the sealed paper, and to the amazement of nearly all present, read out, Dormouse. Apparently, your majesty, he said in some surprise, they are both equally correct. The king scowled, in some way in which he didn't quite understand. He had been tricked. May I suggest, your majesty, the chancellor went on, that they be asked now some question of a different order, such as can be answered after not more than a few minutes' thought, here in your majesty's presence. Some problem in the higher mathematics, for instance, such as might be profitable for a future king to know. What question? Asked his majesty a little nervously. Well, as an example, what is 7 times 6? And behind his hand, he whispered to the king, 42. Not a muscle of the king's face moved, but he looked thoughtfully at the Lord Calomel, supposing his lordship did not know. Well, he said reluctantly, what is the answer? And young Lord Calomel thought for some time, and then said, 54. And you, said the king to Rabbit. Rabbit wondered what to say. As long as he gave the same answers as Calomel, he could not lose in the encounter. Yet in this case, 42 was the right answer. But the king, who could do no wrong even in arithmetic, might decide, for the purposes of the competition, that 54 was an answer more becoming to the future ruler of the country. Was it then safe to say 42? Your Majesty, he said, there are several possible answers to this extraordinarily novel conundrum. At first sight, the obvious solution would appear to be 42. The objection to this solution is that it lacks originality. I have long felt that a progressive country such as ours might well strike out a new line in the matter. Let us agree that in the future, 7 sixes are 54. In that case, the answer, as Lord Calomel has pointed out, is 54. But if your Majesty would prefer to cling to the old style of counting, then your Majesty and your Majesty's Chancellor would make the answer 42. After which, Rabbit bowed gracefully, both to their Majesties and to his opponent, and sat down again. The king scratched his head in a puzzled sort of way. The correct answer, he said, is, or will be in the future, 54. Make a note of that, whispered the Chancellor to the Chief Secretary. Lord Calomel guessed this at his first attempt, Rabbit at his second attempt. I therefore declare Lord Calomel the winner. Shame, said Rabbit. Who said that? Cried the king furiously. Rabbit looked over his shoulder with the object of identifying the culprit, but was apparently unsuccessful. However, went on the king, in order that there should be no doubt in the minds of my people as to the absolute fairness with which this competition is being conducted, there will be one further test. It happens that a king is often called upon to make speeches and exhortations to his people, and for this purpose the ability to stand evenly upon 2 legs for a considerable length of time is of much value to him. The next test, therefore, will be... But at this point Lord Calomel cleared his throat so loudly that the king had to stop and listen to him. Quite so, said the king. The next test, therefore, will be held in a month's time, when his lordship's ankle is healed, and it will be a test to see who can balance himself longest upon 2 legs only. Rabbit lolloped back to his home in the wood, pondering deeply. Now there was an enchanter who lived in the wood, a man of many magical gifts. He could, it was averred by the countryside, extract colored ribbons from his mouth, cook plum puddings in a hat, and produce as many as 10 silk handkerchiefs knotted together from a twist of paper. And that night, after a simple dinner of salad, Rabbit called upon him. Can you, he said, turn a rabbit into a man? I can, he said at last, turn a plum pudding into a rabbit. That, said Rabbit, to be quite frank, would not be a helpful operation. I can turn almost anything into a rabbit, said the enchanter with growing enthusiasm. In fact, I like doing it. Then Rabbit had an idea. Can you turn a man into a rabbit? I did once. At least, I turned a baby into a baby rabbit. When was that? 18 years ago. At the court of King Nicodemus, I was giving an exhibition of my powers to him and his good queen. I asked one of the company to lend me a baby, never thinking for a moment. The young prince was handed up. I put a red silk handkerchief over him and waved my hands. Then I took the handkerchief away. The queen was very much distressed. I tried everything I could, but it was useless. The king was most generous about it. He said that I could keep the rabbit. I carried it about with me for some weeks, but one day it escaped. Dear, dear. He wiped his eyes gently with a red silk handkerchief. Most interesting, said Rabbit. Well, this is what I want you to do. And they discussed the matter from the beginning. A month later, the great standing competition was to take place. When all was ready, the king rose to make his opening remarks. We are now, he began, to make one of the most interesting tests between our 2 candidates for the throne. At the word go, they will... And then he stopped. Why, what's this? He said, putting on his spectacles. Where is the young Lord Calomel? And what is that second rabbit doing? There was no need to bring your brother, he added severely to Rabbit. I am Lord Calomel, said the second rabbit meekly. Oh, said the king. Go, said the chancellor, who was a little deaf. Rabbit, who had been practicing for a month, jumped up on his back paws and remained there. Lord Calomel, who had had no practice at all, remained on all fours. In the crowd at the back, the enchanter chuckled to himself. "How long do I stay like this?" asked Rabbit. "This is all very awkward and distressing," said the king. "May I get down?" said Rabbit. "There is no doubt that Rabbit has won," said the chancellor. "Which Rabbit?" cried the king crossly. "They're both rabbits." "The one with the white spots behind the ears," said Rabbit helpfully. "May I get down?" There was a sudden cry from the back of the hall. "Your Majesty!" "Well, well, what is it?" The enchanter pushed his way forward. "May I look, Your Majesty?" he said in a trembling voice. "White spots behind the ears. Dear, dear, allow me." He seized Rabbit's ears and bent them this way and that. "Ow!" said Rabbit. "It is, Your Majesty, it is." "Is what?" "The son of the late King Nicodemus, whose country is now joined to your own, Prince Silvio." "Quite so," said Rabbit, airily, hiding his surprise. "Didn't any of you recognize me?" "Nicodemus had only one son," said the chancellor, "and he died as a baby." "Not died," said the enchanter, and forthwith explained the whole sad story. "I see," said the king, when the story was ended. "But of course that is neither here nor there. A competition like this must be conducted with absolute impartiality." He turned to the chancellor. "Which of them won that last test?" "Prince Silvio," said the chancellor. "Then, my dear Prince Silvio—" "One moment," interrupted the enchanter, excitedly. "I've just thought of the word. I knew there were some words you had to say." He threw his red silk handkerchief over Rabbit and cried, "Hey presto!" And the handkerchief rose and rose and rose, and there was Prince Silvio. You can imagine how loudly the people cheered. But the king appeared not to notice that anything surprising had happened. "Then, my dear Prince Silvio," he went on, "as the winner of this most interesting series of contests, you are appointed successor to our throne." "Your Majesty," said Silvio, "this is too much," and he turned to the enchanter and said, "May I borrow your handkerchief for a moment? My emotion has overcome me." So on the following day, Prince Rabbit was duly proclaimed heir to the throne before all the people. But not until the ceremony was over did he return the enchanter's handkerchief. "And now," he said to the enchanter, you may restore Lord Calomel to his proper shape." And the enchanter placed his handkerchief on Lord Calomel's head and said, "Hey presto!" And Lord Calomel stretched himself and said, "Thanks very much." But he said it rather coldly, as if he were not really grateful. So they all lived happily for a long time, and Prince Rabbit married the most beautiful princess of those parts, and when a son was born to them, there was much feasting and jollification. And the king gave a great party whereat minstrels, tumblers, jugglers, and such like were present in large quantities to give pleasure to the company. But in spite of a suggestion made by the princess, the enchanter was not present. "But I hear he is so clever," said the princess to her husband. "He has many amusing inventions," replied the prince, "but some of them are not in the best of taste." "Very well, dear," said the princess. I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye.